Let me first introduce the participants in our panel discussion. To my immediate right is Mark Horvit. He's Executive Director of Investigative Reporters and Editors. Next to him is Brendan Fischer. He's a law fellow with the Center for Media and Democracy and recently graduated with honors from the University of Wisconsin Law School. And then next to Brendan is Ciara Torres-Spelliscy. She is a professor at Stetson University. She's an assistant professor of law and teaches constitutional law and election law. Where I know Ciara best is from the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School. That's when we first crossed paths. Let me first set the stage by saying that I don't think it's a coincidence that you've gathered here in Wisconsin, and you couldn't find a better place to underscore the challenges and the issues relating to finding a way to have transparency in a post-Citizens United super PAC world. We are right now going through a recall election involving our governor and involving 4 state senators. And we will probably see upwards of $100 million spent on those recall elections. Much of that money will be spent not by the candidates themselves, although we will see candidate fundraising records doubled and perhaps tripled in some cases. But much, if not most, of the money will actually be spent by interest groups that will sponsor their own advertising. Many of those interest groups, in fact, most of those interest groups are structured in a way that will enable them to conceal the sources of their income. A few of those groups will even be able to conceal the amount of money that they spend. So at best, Wisconsin will be able to see the amount of money spent on campaign reports filed by these interest groups. But in some cases, not only will the public be kept in the dark about the donors to these organizations, but they'll even be kept in the dark about the amount of money spent. And that really speaks volumes about the challenges we have here at the state level in Wisconsin, and they are challenges that are mirrored at the federal level as well. We do not have disclosure laws that were designed to take into account a post-Citizens United world. In Wisconsin, for example, corporate election spending and corporate campaign contributions were banned in 1905. So for over 100 years, there was no such thing as corporate election spending. And of course, when the United States Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United that there can be no limit placed on corporate election spending, this new pipeline was opened through which this torrent of money could flow, but our state laws were not equipped to enable the public to follow that money. We do not have any disclosure laws that require disclosure of those corporate contributors. So we're in a very vulnerable position here in Wisconsin. And of course, as I say, that same dilemma faces us at the federal level and in states across this country. So we have our work cut out for us when we're trying to give the public some clue about who is really behind all that advertising and who is paying for it. So with that, by way of introduction, I want to first turn it over to Ciara Torres-Spelliscy from Stetson University and let her further set the stage and give you some things to think about. Ciara?
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about dark spending after Citizens United. I'll start with the Supreme Court case, then I'll get into the conundrum of how do we follow the money if there is a lack of full disclosure, and then I'll offer you a few policy solutions. So this is a picture of my dad. My dad was a sculptor and a very creative thinker, and when I was a youngster, he used to sit me down and tell me, Ciara, remember to ask the big questions. And I think that's why I am a campaign finance lawyer. So to me, the big question here is, what is the proper role of corporate money in a democracy? And I think there are at least two issues with the way that corporate political spending happens in America today. And I'll tell you the same thing that I told Congress 2 years ago. There's a lack of transparency and a lack of consent. And I hope by the end of my talk, you'll understand what I mean by those two concepts. So all of this started with the Supreme Court case of Citizens United versus the FEC. It was about a documentary called Hillary the Movie. And there were some very narrow questions in Citizens United, the way the case originally started. One of which was, can the FEC, as in the Federal Elections Commission, actually regulate a feature-length film? And there was a huge amount of debate about this, whether it was appropriate for the FEC to regulate a documentary. Another question that was in the case was, could they regulate video on demand? They were clearly able to regulate broadcast. The argument was this was a narrowcast. You had to affirmatively opt in as a viewer in order to see the movie. And then finally, only a small amount of for-profit corporate money was used to make the film. And so one of the narrow ways that the Supreme Court could have disposed of this case would be to rule that this type of nonprofit that had such a tiny amount of for-profit money was not the type of entity that Congress had intended to ban with its for-profit corporate ban. But of course, as we know, the issues in Citizens United were decided on far broader grounds. And the Supreme Court ended up giving First Amendment rights to corporations and unions to buy an unlimited supply of two categories of election ads. One are known as independent expenditures. Those are the Vote for Bob ads. And the other category are electioneering communications, which I sometimes refer to as Bob is the devil type of ads. So, why is a potential flood of corporate money into American elections a problem? I think one problem could be the effect on our democracy. The second problem, which I'm going to focus on a little bit more today, is whose money is it anyway? And if you are talking about a publicly traded corporation, then I would argue that a lot of that money that's being spent in politics is actually attributable to shareholders. And this is what Justice Brandeis once referred to as other people's money. And I think the paradigm shift that Citizens United has caused is actually the following. If a CEO of a publicly traded company wanted to spend money in a federal election before Citizens United, he had to reach into his pocket and pull out his own checkbook. And he could have spent as much money out of his own pocket as he wanted. That was his right under Buckley v. Vallejo. But after Citizens United, he can reach into his other pocket and he can pull out a different checkbook. He can pull out a corporate checkbook, the one that has the corporate logo on it, the one where the bill does not go to his house, it goes to the corporation. And that's where I think we have a potential problem of corporate managers using other people's money in politics. And I see from how long this room is that some of these slides are not going to work, so let me walk you through some of this. Part of what Citizens United does is, before Citizens United, corporations that wanted to spend in politics had to set up a corporate PAC. And corporate PACs at the time basically had a $5,000 per person limit. So you had to gather money in hard money limits, and the people who gave to the corporate PAC were well aware that that money would be used in politics. That is very different than using a corporate treasury to spend in politics. Corporate treasuries in campaign finance, there is no sensible analog under corporate law. But the easy way to think about it is every dime that is in a corporation's bank account is now potentially up for grabs to spend in politics. And one of the problems from a corporate law point of view is that managers can spend corporate money in politics without notifying their shareholders either before or after the fact. And in American law, there is no consent mechanism for shareholders to either consent or object to their funds being used in this particular way. And this could be a problem because the interests of managers and the interests of shareholders may diverge at precisely this point. Managers may have all sorts of reasons why they personally want to spend this money in politics, including most famously trying to get ambassadorships or high-level appointments. Or it may be more psychological than that. It may be that they want to feel politically connected. They want that invitation to the inaugural. And I think over time, what I'm most afraid of is that the incentive structure here runs entirely the wrong way. And what I mean by that is I'm afraid that corporations will give because their competitors are giving. And that that could become a vicious cycle. And one of the things that will protect managers is a precept of law called the business judgment rule. So basically, corporate law protects the day-to-day business management decisions of corporate managers unless it is really outrageous. And my fear, and this is a picture of the Great Wall of China, is that the business judgment rule is going to insulate managers who spend money on politics unless the fact pattern is ridiculous. So I think the average spending in politics will not be subject to shareholder suits. And for you visual learners out here, this is a picture of the United States before Citizens United. The states in green allowed corporate money. The states in white did not. And this is a picture of the United States after Citizens United. And the reason Montana is still white is Montana is still fighting to defend its corporate ban. And right now, in front of the United States Supreme Court, they are deciding whether they will grant cert in that case or not. So I think of Citizens United like this, that it is a dark cloud, but it has a silver lining. And the silver lining is this. The decision was 8-1 in favor of disclosure. And so I think we can apply the old lesson from Watergate, which is if you want to know what's going on in American politics, follow the money. And there are great resources out there if you want to follow the money. There is the National Institute on Money and State Politics, which runs the web page followthemoney.org. There's also opensecrets.org, which tracks federal spending. And the reason why this is not the end of my presentation is there's this problem, which is, this is one of my favorite obscure Simpsons quotes, I can't see through metal, Kent. And the things that I can't see through are 501c4s and 501c6s. And we saw this problem in the 2010 election, where 42% of the independent spending in the federal election was dark. You could not tell who the original donor was. And we'll see what this picture looks like for the 2012 election, whether it will be even darker. And again, the problem is if you funnel money through a 501c4, which is a social welfare organization, or a 501c6, which is a trade association, then the public is none the wiser where the original money came from. And I have a very complicated slide, which I won't go through since it's such a big room and such a small slide. But basically, if the publicly traded corporation spends and they give it to a trade association, there's no requirement to report that to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The trade association does report that to the IRS, but the IRS does not share that with the public. The trade association can then buy a political ad, and the political ad will say brought to you by, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but it will be totally opaque which publicly traded companies were behind the original funding of that ad. And even when the trade association makes their reports at the FEC, the FEC's rules are so lax that it is perfectly legal for them to say, we had a $1 million ad buy and we are going to list no donors. So long story short, the public cannot see which company is behind which political ad. And I will go through how corporate law could help very quickly because I feel I'm running out of time. Corporate law could help by clarifying the rules of the game within the corporation itself. It could fix the notice problem, so we could require corporations to be more transparent to their shareholders. And if there is, for example, a Securities and Exchange Commission rule that requires disclosure across the board for shareholders, well, that means that voters could see that information too. The other thing that corporate law could clarify is the consent mechanism. Right now, the UK has a requirement that before a publicly traded company can spend in a UK election, they have to get authorization from their shareholders. We have no equivalent to that in the United States. So I'm going to run through this very quickly. At the federal level, we could fix some of this through legislation. There's a bill called the Disclose Act, which would help with some of the disclosure problems. There's a bill called the Shareholder Protection Act, which would provide for both transparency of corporate political spending as well as a shareholder vote before political spending happens. Also, the federal agencies within their own purviews could do a lot. I think one of my other co-panelists will talk about the new FCC rule. Meanwhile, at the Securities and Exchange Commission, there's a petition by 10 professors asking for a new transparency rule for publicly traded companies who spend in politics. And we are up to over a 250,000 public comments begging the SEC to promulgate a rule. And I think another of my panelists will also go through the new decision by a court telling the FEC that they had illegally narrowed disclosure requirements. And in the states, the policy options are very parallel. You could have disclosure laws in states for independent expenditures, for electioneering communications. You could also change state corporate laws to bring more transparency and consent. And right now, there's a bill that was just passed by the Connecticut legislature, which would give more transparency to shareholders, as well as require board approval of political expenditures over a certain threshold. And that is on the governor's desk, and he is threatening to veto it. So if you want a story to latch onto, there's one. And if you need a little pick-me-up and you work on transparency, I recommend a law review article that I wrote last year, which is called Has the Tide Turned in Favor of Disclosure? And I think one of the big unreported stories is that transparency is actually winning in the courts. It's winning all the way from district courts all the way to the Supreme Court. So I think the good news that I can leave you with is transparency has some room to breathe. The courts are going to allow legislatures to pass new laws that require transparency. But the question I'll leave you with is, will legislatures actually take them up on this offer? Thank you.
Thank you, Ciara.
So I'm going to speak about three things. The first will be some of the constitutional amendments that have been discussed to respond to Citizens United. The second will be a decision that might introduce a little bit more transparency into the system. And the third will be a ruling by the FCC, which might make your jobs a little bit easier. So the first is the constitutional amendments. So this week, Senator Leahy announced that the Senate Judiciary Committee will be holding hearings on constitutional amendments that have been proposed. So far, there have been 13 constitutional amendments proposed in Congress. And though the phrase corporations are not people has been most associated with this movement, the constitutional proposals have been more nuanced and varied than this. I think what we've seen, especially in these primaries, is that we need more than just declaring that corporations are not people, because you still have the Bob Perrys and Foster Frieses and Sheldon Adelsons of the world who are able to influence elections individually. So even if you ended all corporate rights immediately, these individuals would still be able to influence elections. So I think there's 5 elements that have been discussed when talking about constitutional amendments, and the different proposals have included various pieces of these. So the first and most narrow set of amendments would focus specifically on countering Citizens United, would reaffirm Congress's authority to regulate elections. So this would authorize Congress and the states to pass campaign finance laws without fear that the Supreme Court would strike them down as unconstitutional. The second element would be the corporations are not people idea, declaring that corporate entities can be governed by Congress and the states, but doing this alone, would still leave the deep-pocketed donors able to influence elections. And also on the state level, there are a lot of corporate rights. Corporations have a lot of the rights guaranteed by statute in the states. So if it was done away with at the federal level, it may not have a huge change in the way the world actually operates. And then a variant of that, the third element, is just regulating corporate personhood. So this would be asserting Congress's authority to regulate corporate rights, not necessarily declaring that corporations have no rights, but just asserting Congress's authority to regulate them. And then a variant of that would be limiting the application of the First Amendment to corporations. Instead of going all the way and saying corporations are not people, just saying that the First Amendment does not apply to them. The fourth element would be declaring that election spending is not protected by the First Amendment. So this goes back to the Buckley v. Vallejo decision, which kind of declared that money is speech. And that's I think a lot of people find that objectionable. And then the fifth would be creating some sort of public financing. So these are the different elements that I think are being talked about right now. And like I said, there's 13 different amendments that have been proposed, so this is an ongoing process. What the amendment we like the most at the Center for Media and Democracy is the Deutsch and Sanders amendment. This would prohibit business corporations from spending money on elections. It would restore the power of Congress and the states to regulate election spending. I think this one is the one we like the most, but I think this is an ongoing process. Obviously, for any of these, it requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the state legislatures to really make a change. So this is an ongoing process. It's a conversation really about what our priorities are and how we want our elections to run. So the next thing I'll discuss is the Van Hollen decision. So this decision came down on March 30th in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. And this decision struck down the FEC's 2007 regulations about disclosure requirements. Basically what it did is close a giant loophole that developed in 2007. So this applied to the electioneering communications. These are the TV, radio, or newspaper ads that refer to a clearly identified candidate, run 60 days before a general election or 30 days before a primary, but unlike express advocacy, they don't explicitly say vote for or against the candidate. Basically, because of this ruling, any entity that pays for an electioneering communication out of its general account has to name the donors who gave more than $1,000. So this is likely to apply to the Crossroads GPSs, some of the Koch-funded groups, a lot of these groups that have been operating, with the dark money that Ciara talked about. So the way this loophole really developed is that when Congress originally passed McCain-Feingold in 2003, they prohibited corporations from engaging in electioneering communications, but they required that all donors giving towards these groups that make electioneering communications, they have to disclose the donors over $1,000. And then in 2007, the Supreme Court said that the McCain-Feingold Act is unconstitutional as applied to expenditures by for-profit corporations. for anything besides express advocacy. So it basically said that corporations and unions can spend on these electioneering communications. So the FEC was kind of stuck in this position of trying to create a rule that fell in between what Congress intended when they passed McCain-Feingold and what the Supreme Court dictated in Wisconsin Right to Life in this 2007 decision. So what they said is that you have to disclose donations over $1,000 if they're specifically earmarked for electioneering communications. And the way that, and this was a big loophole, because the way that groups could get around this is by saying that all of their donations were to their general treasuries. None of them were specifically earmarked. And because the FEC had been deadlocked for a long time, they were unable to, or they never actually went ahead and created any sort of rules that would fix this. And basically what the district court said was that the agency went beyond its authority. The statute was clear. It said contributions over $1,000 have to be disclosed. Their effort to harmonize these decisions was basically illegal. It went beyond what their authority really was. So this seems like a really great thing. It seems like this should end the dark money, but there's still a lot of murkiness, because some of the other existing FEC rules are still on the books that don't necessarily jibe with the U.S. Supreme Court decisions. The FEC is mostly deadlocked, and the water is still basically muddy. And I think a lot of groups might still be trying to just defy these rules because they understand that the FEC is deadlocked, that their enforcement capabilities are limited. And they could also continue avoiding their donors by setting up a separate account to spend on political advertising, and then only disclosing the donors that give to that particular account. So it's promising and it's exciting, and like Ciara said, this is an example of the courts favoring disclosure. But with the system that we have, it still may not be as promising as it first sounds. So the third thing I'll talk about is the FCC ruling. So the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, requires disclosure of funding and spending by PACs, but for the most part does not cover the nonprofits, which are playing a growing role in our elections. And this does not cover the so-called issue ads. And really the only way to determine how much these groups are spending is not through the FEC filing database, but really from just going to the stations, going to the broadcast stations, seeing the ad buys, seeing the spreadsheets of ad purchases, how much they spent, when the ads were running, and who was spending them, or who was making the purchase. And for years, groups like Free Press have been asking the FCC to require broadcasters to make this information available online, and they've been lobbying against it for a long time. And they've been successful. They spent millions on lobbying, and they've been mostly successful. And I don't know if anyone's ever tried actually going to the station and collecting this data, but it's really burdensome. And sometimes they're going to charge you copying fees. And in a state like Wisconsin, it's huge. To drive to every single broadcast station in the state to try and get a handle on what a group like Americans for Prosperity is doing is almost impossible. So on April 27th, just really recently, the FCC issued a long overdue ruling and will require network affiliates for the 4 national broadcasting companies, so that's ABC, NBC, Fox, and CBS, in the 50 largest markets, to put their contracts into PDF format, to put the ad buys, the spreadsheet of ad buys into PDF format, and upload them into a database, which is going to be hosted by the FCC and accessible to the public. So this is going to contain information about which groups are buying the ads, the key personnel in the groups, and then how much they're paying for the time. So this is really, really good. It's long overdue. They have about 6 months to get prepared, which means the data is going to be ready, should be ready in time for the November elections. But it's really only a partial victory. So it's not going to cover cable, and it's only going to apply to the top 50 markets. So this includes Milwaukee and the surrounding area, which is Racine, Kenosha, Waukesha, the surrounding suburbs, but it's not going to include Madison. Madison's the number 85 market, and the ruling only applies to the top 50. And in other places like in Illinois, where WGN is a huge player, it's not going to apply to ad buys made on WGN. In Iowa, which is likely a battleground state, none of the media markets in Iowa are in the top 50. So you're not going to get any of this disclosure in Iowa. So some groups are trying to fill in the gaps. The Center for Public Integrity, Free Press, the Sunlight Foundation are trying to crowdsource this effort, have college students, reporters, other citizens drive to the places that are not in the top 50 market, get the files and send them to the Sunlight Foundation, which will then upload them to a database that users can then sort and filter. So that's a really great resource, and that's really promising. So as far as things to ask, as far as things to focus on, I think this would be a really good one. Expanding this FCC ruling to apply beyond the top 50 markets and beyond just these top four networks. So.
Thank you, Brendan. Next up is Mark Horvit from Investigative Reporters and Editors.
All right, we've covered a lot of stuff already, so I will try to be pretty brief. I'm going to talk about the part that the journalists like to do the most, which is the following the money part. And just a few quick points on that sort of to expand on what's already been talked about. So mostly applying to the federal level, which applies to everybody here, regardless of where you're from, as far as I know. We've sort of couched this as a Citizens United panel, but Citizens United itself at the federal level didn't reduce transparency, right? I mean, you can still get campaign finance reports on the super PACs the same way you can on others. There's two ways they can file. They either file quarterly or increasingly monthly. And the only downside on the monthly filings is that depending on when an election comes up, particularly as just happened in the primary season, depending on when your primary was, you might not get one of those monthly reports until much too late to see what the last minute spending was. I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes. I'm just going to go to a couple of websites, some of which have already been discussed, to show you where you can go to find some of this information if you want to and what some people are doing with it. Also, we haven't really talked about the expenditure side as much. It's hard to get the money on. It takes longer to get the information on where the money's coming from, but they have to file within 24 or 48 hours, depending on the expenditure, what they've spent it on. So if you're trying to track the influence of the organization, that you can do in fairly close to real time. You just can't tell until later where that money itself had come from. And as we talked about at the beginning, the bigger problem in a lot of ways are the 501c, because you don't have any transparency there. I spoke to several journalists who have been covering this, just to sort of someone from the New York Times. I want to give credit here. The New York Times, AP, and the Center for Public Integrity, just to get a feeling for where they're looking for this information and what their concerns are. And what was really interesting to me was that they didn't really agree at all on the current state of the climate. And the most interesting thing to me was what a New York Times reporter who delves into this, who's been doing campaign finance stuff for years, talked about. He thinks in some ways this election may actually become at the federal level more transparent, not less, because part of what's bothering people is all the money, the dark money you talked about that's going to the nonprofits. That's not new. It's just that in some ways we're recognizing it more now, or you have somebody like Karl Rove who sets up a 501c4 to collect money and then give it to his super PAC, so you can't figure out where the money's coming from. And that's such a brilliantly blatant move that it sort of shines a spotlight on that. But what his take was that in fact a lot of the big donors that you're seeing now, a lot of the big named individuals particularly, may just be giving their money to the super PACs because they can, when previously they were giving these to the 501cs because that was the only way they could do it. So in some ways you may be tracking more of the money than less at this level, because people who want to give a lot of money and don't mind being known are using that avenue instead, which is an interesting way to look at it. Let's see if there are any other major points that I wanted to make. One other problem that I do see is that anyone who's ever dealt with trying to go through campaign finance information knows that even if you go down, whether it's local or state or federal, the campaigns list the donor, right? But they often don't give very much information. So if it's just a name, you can't tell where they work. It might be a company that you're not sure how to track. There have been several examples that have come up in the last few months of vague company or names that are generic, and it's been difficult to tell where they came from. That issue was one thing when people were limited on how much money they could give. If you were trying to track down a $1,000 or $2,000 campaign contribution, you wanted to know who it was from, but it wasn't that big a deal. But now when you can have $1 million or a $500,000 donation, which is difficult to sort of get a bead on, it really exacerbates that problem of reporting. And so what both the New York Times, AP, they've literally put teams of reporters on these reports, and they're using LexisNexis, they're using Google, they're going through Secretary of State reports, they're drilling down to try to figure out and fill in the gaps on these forms to figure out who some of these givers are and donors are that aren't immediately transparent. So that's one issue which has come up, which is that now that one individual can give so much, the difficulty in nailing some of those down becomes several times greater. Now I'm going to attempt to walk and talk at the same time, so this could be tough. But I wanted to show a couple of websites really quickly. All right, I'm not going to walk and do the stairs. All right, let's see. There's a limit to what I will do for you people. All right, let's see. All right, I had opened up a bunch of stuff in a browser, I hope. Awesome. All right, so this is the Center for Public Integrity. I'm just going to show you a few sites. Some of them are put together by journalists and news organizations, and some of them were already discussed that are put together by sort of advocacy or nonprofit groups that have been doing this kind of work for years. This is CPI is based in DC, and this is their Consider the Source site. And what they're doing is, check this out if you haven't. You can look up a PAC, and what you can do is they've done a lot of research on who's behind it, where the money's coming from, who the organizers are, who the treasurers are, and you can really drill down and get tons of detailed information on individual PACs. So I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through and show you how the searches work, but trust me, they're awesome. So the URL is it's iWatch News. What I'll do is I'll tell you, and then maybe there's a way we can just send this list out, Ken, to attendees or something, so you'll have it. But it's iWatchNews.org/politics/consider-source. They don't make it easy, but all you have to do, if you go to Google and do iWatch Consider the Source, you will show up there. The magic of Google. ProPublica has this thing called PAC Track, which is really cool. It was even better during the primary season because you'll see that what they did, and they still do, just the primaries aren't too exciting anymore. But for any of you who still have one coming up, you can track the Super PAC money by state, by primary. So you can click and see what's coming in when, which is kind of cool. We'll go somewhere where there'd been, well, here's Wisconsin from. And so it's a nice way. You can do it by primary calendar, you can do it by latest spending, you can do it by top contributor. And again, it's another way to slice and dice the money. And what I would suggest you do if you're interested in this subject at all and you're interested in tracking the money and the giving in your state is go to several of these sites and see what's available and just see what you're comfortable with and what you like. Here's the New York Times version of the same. This is their independent spending totals. I like it because it has the floating heads, which is a nice extra touch. You can see how, and what they've done is that you can go weekly on giving, or you can do the totals to date, which is what I've got here so far. No, I don't think so. No, everything I'm showing you so far, I just got without. When you drill in far enough, it might be, but I clicked around in here for a while this morning, and I didn't pay anything. Yeah. Didn't keep clicking. It maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe when you get in far enough, they're restricting access. I guess I'm not sure about that because I'll admit that I am a subscriber to the New York Times. So you could do that too, I suppose. But they have a lot of good stuff, and if it's all of it's in front of the paywall, I would check it out. But in case it's not, we'll fly along to Open Secrets, which was mentioned at the beginning. This is the Center for Responsive Politics, and they've been doing great work in this area for a long time. And they provide a lot of the data that other organizations like Sunlight use to further analyze. And they've got a great site for on super PACs. They actually wrote an article for IRE about all the resources that they've got. If anybody's interested, let me just, before I forget, I will give you my email address. At IRE, we have a lot of resources for covering this stuff. If you're interested, I'll be more than happy to email or send some of that stuff to you. So real quick, it's just mark@ire.org. That's mark@ire.org. I can't say, I was going to say call today, but that you can't call that. All right, and so basically what you can do here is you'll see that you can click on each PAC and really drill down and see who's giving, who all the givers are, how much they've raised, how much they've spent, what they've spent it on. They let you know what each one of the individual PACs, who it's for, in case you're not sure. And this is a good time to mention. I'm not going to go to this link, though I have it on the list in the interest of time. But the FEC now is doing something that it wasn't doing before, which is making a separate list that you can download as an Excel spreadsheet that it lists every single one of these PACs and who it supports for the House, for the Senate, and for President. So if you have organizations that you're seeing pop up in your state and you're not sure who they're with, you can go to the FEC and you can either search that list online or you can download it right from their website. And it's a great way to sort of figure out who's behind all these organizations. Yeah, it's updated, and it also has dollar totals with it as well. So that's a pretty cool thing, and that's something they weren't doing before. Almost lastly, this is the other one that was mentioned. It's the National Institute on Money and State Politics. They've also been around for many years, and they do a great job of crunching contributions at the statewide level. So every state races that are statewide. And they also have an independent spending chart, which is pretty cool. You can click by state. And so if you've never messed with this site, this is one that I wish I'd known about when I was covering this stuff a few years ago. Many states, every state has a site where you can get, or somewhere where you can get campaign contribution information. Some of them are better than others. This is a good one-stop shopping place, and particularly if you're trying to do something regional, which goes outside your own boundaries, this can be a much faster way of getting that information. And finally, which one was this? Oh, Sunlight. Since they've come up so much, we will give them a quick plug. This is their Follow the Unlimited Money side. All of these sites are with the super PACs are dealing with the same information and just presenting it in different ways, or maybe they slice it in a way that's more helpful to you. So I guess, like I said, what I would do is we'll try to get this list out and just click through it, see what's useful to you, and check out that FEC list, and I will stop there.
One point that needs to be made, following up on things that both Brendan and Ciara said, when people talk about corporate election spending, I know that for many people, they immediately assume that we're talking about business corporations. In some cases, we are talking about business corporations, but some of the major players in election spending right now are nonprofit corporations. It's the 501c4s and the 501c6s. And in fact, if you look at Wisconsin and the independent spending that's being done in elections here and in the midst of these recall elections, it's mostly nonprofit corporations that are the big participants. And so that's a distinction that needs to be drawn. When people talk about corporate election spending, they are not only talking about business corporations. And then following up on something that Mark said, I think there's really it's important to draw a distinction between the situation at the federal level and the situation in many of the states. In the Citizens United decision, the United States Supreme Court, a 5-member majority in the Supreme Court, ruled that there could be unlimited spending by corporations and other interest groups. They also said that unlimited spending would not give rise to corruption or even the appearance of corruption, and it would not cause people to lose faith in democracy. Now, my own personal view, when I read that ruling, is I thought, what planet are these people on? But what that gave birth to, and then a subsequent ruling in a case called Free Speech Now, was the creation of the federal super PACs. And it is true that there now can be these unlimited donations and unlimited spending, but there is eventually disclosure of those donors. At the state level, however, the way this is playing out, what Free Speech Now and Citizens United, how it's manifesting itself in states, including here in Wisconsin, is that you now have unlimited donations and unlimited spending by these groups, mostly nonprofit corporations. But here, because of the lack of action by our state legislature, there isn't requirement to disclose the donors. So you could just as well call them super duper PACs here in places like Wisconsin, where they have all the ability to do what the federal super PACs are doing, but on top of it, they're different in one very important respect. They can keep their donors totally a secret and keep the public in the dark about where that money is being raised. That, I think, underscores the vulnerability that states have in this post-Citizens United super PAC world. With that, you're up next. I'd like to really throw the rest of our time open to your questions and comments. And
I'm hoping you can give a little bit more clarification on the issue of Citizens United and its effect on state campaign finance laws. We know about what Montana's doing. I'm from Indiana. We do have limits on corporate contributions. So can you address whether those laws are automatically invalidated or what the situation is on those?
So there's a distinction between corporate contributions directly to candidates, those are still banned in 21 states. And I expect the next round of litigation will be challenging one or several of those corporate contribution bans. What Montana is defending is its corporate expenditure ban. So Montana, like 21 other states pre-Citizens United, had a corporate ban, and they had it for basically 100 years. And their state Supreme Court in December upheld it, and they said, we are applying Citizens United to our fact pattern, and we find that this survives judicial scrutiny, that this is a constitutional corporate ban. And that is what is before the Supreme Court right now, as we are sitting here. They will decide whether to summarily reverse it or whether they will actually give Montana the opportunity to have an oral argument and present its facts and its history and defend its law. So we'll see. I don't know how that story is going to end.
And I can give you an example of one specific state, being Wisconsin. As I said, Wisconsin banned corporate campaign contributions and corporate election spending back in 1905. What Citizens United did effectively was invalidate half of that law. It invalidated the ban on corporate election spending. The ban on corporate contributions directly to candidates still stands. But unlike Montana, Wisconsin chose to allow the effects of Citizens United to stand with respect to the corporate election spending ban. Montana is the one state that said, now wait a second. You said in Citizens United that unlimited corporate election spending would not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption, would not cause people to lose faith in democracy. And that's exactly the grounds that the Montana Supreme Court chose to say, wait a second, we have a track record of corruption here in Montana, and because of that track record, we believe, even under Citizens United, our law is still valid. Other states could have chosen that route as well. Wisconsin, for one, did not, and chose to allow corporate election spending, unlimited corporate election spending, to commence.
I'm actually somewhat uncomfortable with some of what's being discussed in that it is being based on the premise that money equals corruption. You say, what planet are you on? Well, I'm kind of from the same planet where I represent a lot of media members who would bristle at the notion that the money that comes in from their advertisers would therefore influence their news decisions. And on the political side of it, that if you have corporate cash in elections, that is not per se bad if it is not then connected to the actions of the particular politicians or the people acting. And so that's why the disclosure is important, so we can make the connection between those two things. But by itself, the money is not necessarily the issue. I would also feel somewhat uncomfortable with this championing of the FCC rule to require the broadcasters to disclose their contracts, because again, coming from an organization that represents both broadcasters and media print journalists, I think there are many who would also be uncomfortable if those in the print media were being required to disclose their advertising contracts as well. So I'm not sure I'm quite there when we're talking about the evils of this and saying and making that a given, when, like Mark, I'm saying as long as you're following the money, make that connection between the money and the individual.
So as for the FCC ruling, I may not have made this clear originally, but why I think this is a good thing is because it goes towards the dark money, because it helps expose what the nonprofits are doing, and without that you have no idea, and you can't make that connection between the expenditure and any future legislative activity. Maybe there's another way of going about it, but we're not there yet. And I think also that there is a distinction between the freedom of the press and freedom of speech as it applies to elections. The press, I mean, at the most basic level, there's an explicit exception or an explicit protection of the press in the First Amendment, and I think it's misleading to blur contributions for political purposes with and calling that free speech and the idea that the press is protected, because the press is protected and it's distinct from spending on elections for the purpose of influencing elections, and in many cases for the purpose of buying favor with legislators.
Yeah, Toby Nixon from Washington Coalition for Open Government. My question is for Ciara. You mentioned in your remarks that there was no mechanism for corporate shareholders to require consent or notification of corporate contributions. But it seems to me like if they were really concerned about it, they could, at an annual meeting or whatever, amend the bylaws to require that. And I'm curious if you agree with it, that could be a possibility.
True, you can amend the bylaws, but then, I mean, if you think of the number of corporations that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange, which the last time I checked was somewhere around 4,000. So you would have to go corporation by corporation by corporation to amend bylaws. So I think that's the heavier lift if say your goal is transparency of the spending. What there has been over the past couple of years, and this actually predated Citizens United, is shareholder resolutions have been brought at many of the S&P 100 asking for more transparency of political spending. And I think of the S&P 500, now 100 corporations are voluntarily transparent, which is great. And it took years of shareholders bringing this up, negotiating with the corporations, engaging. But my objection, being a realist to that, is that's voluntary. The moment they get their fingers burned on a disclosure of political spending that, you know, creates a boycott or whatever reaction, they can just shut up like clams. It's a voluntary regime. And so what I would prefer is a uniform rule from the Securities and Exchange Commission that applies across the board.
There was mention made earlier about finding out information from contracts and advertising. You can find that information out now. You just have to go to the station to get it. I mean, as I understand the FCC difficulty, it's can you put it on the web and make it accessible to everyone rather than having to drive to the TV station? In other words, this information is available now. You just can't access it readily. The question I have for you, ma'am, is does the SEC's writ run to privately held companies?
It would not. So it would be limited to publicly traded corporations, and which is one of the reasons why I and many people in coalitions that I'm in have been working on the Disclose Act, which would change the law federally for all spenders. But because the Congress is so horribly deadlocked, I think we could, hold our breath and turn blue before they would act and actually pass that legislation.
I recommend to all of you that you look at the history of Montana in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and you look at other places in this country, and what you find is the robber barons in multiple aspects, timber, mining, etc., came to own large numbers of politicians. And that's why the Citizens United ruling and the Montana challenge to it, which I don't think is going to go anywhere, but it's wonderful. But keep that in mind. A wonderful book, old book called The War of the Copper Kings. I recommend it to you.
And you're sitting in a state where bribing a public official was perfectly legal for the first half century of statehood. Wisconsin became a state in 1848. It wasn't until 1897 that bribing a public official was outlawed. And we too have a history of railroad barons and timber barons owning politicians and buying votes, and ultimately that led to a wave of reform that included the banning of bribery in 1897 and then the prohibition of corporate contributions in corporate election spending in 1905 because of the reality on the ground in this state, and the fact that you had these interests who bought politicians and owned our government. Now, I think in a very important sense, we've come full circle, and we're right back to the same kinds of conditions that were present in this state in the late 1800s. And I guess I would just remind people that the American experiment was 200 years old, and the First Amendment was 185 years old before the United States Supreme Court reinterpreted the First Amendment to mean that money equals speech. It was 1976 that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Buckley versus Vallejo that money is speech. And I think it's important to reflect on the fact that the First Amendment was 185 years old before that interpretation became the law of the land.
While everyone has been expecting a deluge of public corporate contributions, spending, independent spending, from the treasury accounts of corporations in this current election cycle, and that was really the great fear and anxiety about the Citizens United decision, both before and afterwards, that in fact that spending hasn't happened, or at least those funds have not gone in to the super PACs on which everyone has been focusing, that the super PACs have been heavily funded either by very wealthy private individuals, or in some cases closely held private corporations that are really just the same as a private individual because they are just the left pocket of a rich person. And so my question is, do we think that in fact everybody was wrong, miscalculated, that public corporations simply don't want to spend their money from their treasury funds heavily to try to influence the outcome of a presidential election? Or are they in fact spending as much as we all feared, or most people in this room probably feared they would spend, but are doing so through the nonprofit entities that you were also describing in a way that is deliberately obscured?
That's what several of the journalists who I talked to this past week, that's what a lot of people are speculating. And the problem is there is no way to know, but you're right. If you go through any of those websites we just talked about and look at the major contributors, they're individuals. And so there is a lot of concern that in fact what's happening is what has been happening is that this money is just going to the 501c because corporations don't want to be, I think what happened to some extent is that people didn't take into account the fact that while you could legally give as much money as a corporation as you wanted to, you could still potentially have the PR fallout and other things of being attached to that candidate or to the political process. So there's potentially a PR thing which is holding back those donations. The problem is that there are other avenues they can still use. I mean, do you know, is there any evidence specifically of whether that's happening or not, a measurable way of telling?
I mean, one of the few states where we saw corporate political spending, which was transparent, was in Minnesota in the 2010 election. And that's when Target got boycotted. That's why 3M's shareholders last week asked the company to stop spending in politics. But the only reason that was possible is Minnesota had some of the strongest disclosure laws in the country. I think it's quite likely that these same companies were in other states, but you couldn't see it.
I spent 10 years as a journalist and then was a political operative and now work as a lobbyist, so I've been on all sides of this. And I want to thank one of the speakers earlier who said that reminded all of us that our access is better than it's ever been. And I think we need to remember that. It's excellent right now, and it continues to get better. But I'm also a little bit uncomfortable with some of what's been said, and I think that there are two words that need to be provided for some context, and they're coordination and limits. It is currently illegal for someone to coordinate with a candidate outside, or a campaign outside of a certain set limit for a number. It's also illegal to give more than a set amount to a given campaign. And that's largely why most of these outside interest groups have been set up, is so that they can get around those limits and spend money to the extent that they want to help elect a candidate. So, all this stuff that we've been talking about has arisen because we have these really hard and fast limits. And I think as an organization that advocates for disclosure, ironically enough, there's a lot of good research and good thinking out there that shows that if you want more disclosure, do away with the limits. Get rid of the limits, and then people can just freely give what they want to give to who they want to give to, and then we can just have disclosure within that context. I think it's also important for us to remember that it's easy to conflict, to bring together improperly campaign finance laws and campaign finance disclosure. And our organization is about openness, not necessarily about advocating for specific campaign finance laws. And the last point I'll make quickly is that remember, money doesn't necessarily work. Everyone has brought up, several people have brought up Sheldon Adelson. Well, his favorite candidate is Newt Gingrich. Money in politics can be a corrupting influence, but thanks to social media, thanks to the internet, thanks to media, it is now more difficult than ever for money to have an impact on an election.
One of the things that I have to add here, tracking the money in Wisconsin, is that, boy, if you look at a state level, from a state perspective, we've gone from a point where 100% of campaign money was disclosed. Every single dollar was reported in some way to state authorities, whether it was independent expenditures by interest groups or campaign contributions to candidates and their campaign spending. We've gone from a time where 100% of the money was disclosed to a time where we have some elections where the majority of the money is in the dark, where the public is kept in the dark about the origins of that money. So to claim that this is a glory, sort of the best of all possible ages from a transparency standpoint, at least speaking from a state perspective, that couldn't be further from the truth. We're at a point now where it is easier to conceal political money than it has been at any time in our lifetime in the state of Wisconsin.
Next to last question.
My name is Arthur Cole Riggs. I'm a local First Amendment advocate. About the concept that money doesn't always work, with the Newt Gingrich example, or really any campaign, the goal isn't always to win the campaign. It is to influence the conversation, and in that case, any money that you spend will be effective in influencing the dialogue. And this is, I guess, a recommendation for anyone who knows anyone who collects and organizes the data. If we could have like a votes per dollar spent way to categorize, or in other ways, dollars per vote earned in the general election. If it cost, in this case, Walker has spent $25 million in his primary so far, and he received 613,000 votes. So before the general election, he's spent $35 per vote that he has earned. And I think that would be one way for people to grasp how much money is being spent in these elections.
I'm glad to see there's progress on disclosure, both on web tools that are available for people to inform themselves, and also laws and regulations being changed. But I'm wondering to what extent disclosure is effective in exposing connections between fundraising and political decisions, and even at the next step, to what extent voters are paying attention, because at some point you get it's so much information, and you get I think some fatigue. And I'm not saying that voters don't have an obligation to inform themselves, but maybe what the average voter can practically do will just be the tip of the iceberg.
On that point, on the federal level and in some states, there's a website, there's an organization called MapLight, if you're familiar with it, and what they do is they take the campaign contribution information from Open Secrets and they pair it with voting records, and they show you after a vote's been taken, say in Congress, if you're a member of Congress voted yes or no, and then what percentage of money they took from donors that have been identified with the industries on both sides of that issue. And so that's a fascinating site. If you haven't look at that site if you haven't. It shows that very clearly. Now, how many people care? I don't know. I don't know. And I think in the end that you can pass all the laws you want and you can change the rules 16 different times. And I think if nothing else, we've learned over time that nothing is going to stop this. It's just not. You can write whatever law you want and they're going to find some other way to get around it. It's It just is. There's too much money. There's too much at stake. And if it's not one thing, it will be another thing. And I know that's probably cynical, but I just think it's. I think we can worry about changing the laws all we want, but the key is to, be as engaged as you can, track as much as you can, and just be aware that people get elected because people give them stuff, and those people who give them stuff get stuff.
Let's thank this panel.